Okay. Not familiar, but by the
nor to me, but my wife is from New Jersey, so she is Slavic, and for her, the sacred soil is New Jersey. So this is what brings us back here.
Okay. Cool.
Exit do you live off, Martin?
Sorry, mate?
What exit do you live off?
Oh, we're on the Garden State Parkway now. We're not even on the turnpike.
I understand.
But basically, if it's relevant to the turnpike, the nearest one is exit 4. Our nearest big city is Philly. Philly's about 75 miles away.
I've got you located in my mind's eye. Let me share a story with you. I'm a 1982 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and I'm practicing law here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was the requirement in our plebe year for every plebe to memorize the name and hometown of every mate in his squad. And our squad leader added a twist for all of our classmates who were from New Jersey. We had to memorize their exit numbers as well.
Oh, exactly. Because my mother-in-law is still going strong at 98 in Carteret, New Jersey. And that, of course, is exit, exit 12 on the turnpike. And it's just one down from where they shot the Sopranos TV shows, which is up to Elizabeth, exit 13.
That would be Sopranos headquarters.
Exactly. And you must have seen, that wonderful iconic shot at the beginning of every episode when Tony drives out of the Lincoln Tunnel and was driving south on the turnpike.
Yes.
You'll remember they even show a graveyard there, right? My father-in-law is buried in that very same graveyard. He even asked that his grave should have a view of the Exxon oil refinery because he worked there or close to it for so many years. He was an engineer in the oil business.
Outstanding. That's something.
Were you originally? Well, anyway, sorry, I'm sidetracked.
I was from New York originally. Yes.
Which part?
We lived in Manhattan, although my father grew up in the Astoria neighborhood of Queens.
But my God, you are a New York aristocrat, Peter.
No,
I'm going to make sure that Marty and Peter have each other's contact information.
Oh, please. You're a psychic man. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Because Martin, I truly enjoyed your lecture on Winston Churchill and and his interactions with Franklin Roosevelt. I truly am grateful to have attended that. Thank you, Matthew.
Of course, yeah. No, I
Thank
think
you,
that,
Pete.
the essence, the essential character that we're always looking for the Friends of the Rising Tide Foundations is really people who have a strong living sense of history. As it happened, not as it is interpreted by some ideology or another, but really this passion for the truth, right? Since
That's Alex. That's Alex.
That's Alex. That's exactly. And this is the beautiful thing, right? Is that we're in a situation right now where it's commonly known that he who controls the past controls the future. It's been repeated and repeated, this mantra, to the point that it's lost a lot of the power of the meaning that it actually holds. Since, I mean, everyone is used to hearing on the radio, on mainstream media today, that we're replicating many of the same disastrous decisions that got us into World War II, except the very fact of how the history is being presented is the complete inversion of how it actually happened, in the sense that we are being told that today's liberal democratic freedom fighters, the heirs of the Allied Alliance, that defeated the Nazi machine, is located in NATO. It's located in Ukraine, and the great freedom fighters of Ukraine around the wonderful JFK character of the 21st century, Zelensky. And the real Nazis are actually now being represented by the figure of Vladimir Putin. the invader who's now trying to install a Russian Reich around the world, starting with Ukraine, unless we stop him now. And so there's various flavors and twists and spins to this story, but it's a lie completely when you start looking at this history. And for this reason, oh, I'm saying all these things, I'm not recording anything. That's okay. Here, I'll just hit record now.
Recording in progress.
Got it.
I'm very happy today that we have the pleasure, the honor of hosting none other than Alex Krainer, a good friend, an associate, a collaborator who is based on the other side of the ocean, but has been looking at and unraveling a lot of the lies of history that have kept us from, I think, properly finalizing the victory of 1945 as a battle. And people think the war was won, but in fact, it was just a battle that was won. And the war itself was hardly finalized. And in fact, when people start looking at what were the consequences of what was behind the rise of the Cold War, what was behind the growth of NATO in the first place, what is behind the current crises that are putting us onto a path of a new world war, it has a lot to do with certain things that were unresolved in 1945 and certain powers that took back control of especially the transatlantic community, militarily, economically, culturally, which before 1945 sounded very Nazi. But we don't use those terms anymore in that way. We're not supposed to. But Alex has done a remarkable trilogy as part of a broader study of history that really blew me out of the water. It is going to be contained for those who would like to really read his writings, including his remarkable book on Bill Browder, The Grand Deception, the Bill Browder hoax. That'll be available in the link to this video. But basically, not only was it what was unresolved in 1945, but the stories of what caused the rise of Nazism in the first place, and the role specifically of British secret diplomacy, which this is not a new phenomenon being a problem causing arsons and fires around the world. This goes back a long way, and World War II cannot be understood without understanding the role that of British secret diplomacy and many other things that Alex artfully does. So without further ado, we're gonna have a Q&A period. I would like it if people, when it comes time for the Q&A, to put your names like usual into the chat box. I'll call upon you. If you don't want to speak aloud your question, you're welcome to just write it out, and I will read it to Alex. But first and foremost, Alex, thank you so much for devoting your time this Sunday, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor. First of all, warm greetings to everyone from Monaco. I just like to prepare. I haven't unraveled anything. I think I just kind of synthesized a part of history that remains obscure in the text, and that even in the text that reveals them, they're kind of like you have to kind of extract certain points to connect them to get the a certain kind of perspective that is not normally communicated in most textbooks that I've read so far. But anyway, I'll do a share screen. I'll go through a PowerPoint presentation because the story is a bit too convoluted for me to just wing it. But don't worry, we only have about 120 slides to go through, so it's going to be a cinch. So okay, let me just figure out how to do screen sharing.
Just the little green button that says share screen.
Green button, yeah, it's pretty obvious. All right, share. All right, so yeah, let's go. So just a word about me. I'm a market analyst, commodities trader, technology development, hedge fund manager between 2007 and 2020. I've done research in domains of geopolitics, history, technology, psychology, and health. I also work as an author. I publish articles at my blog, The Naked Hedge, my website, iSystem Trend Following, and on Zero Hedge occasionally. And you can find me on Twitter at Naked Hedge. I published 3 books. The two on the left and right are business titles, and the one in the middle is Grand Deception, which got, actually everything got banned by Amazon, but that's a different story. So about today's presentation, we're going to look at appeasement and the false historical parallels that are being drawn today, as Matthew just suggested. We're going to look at the 1938 Munich Treaty, the destruction of Czechoslovakia, and the role of the British Empire. We're going to look at the Britain's larger agenda in the World War II, her 1939 betrayal of Poland, and we're going to finish with the three-block agenda today. Just for you to keep on the radar, I think that this presentation is very relevant to today's event, particularly from the point of view of whether Russia's intervention in Ukraine can be justified. All right. So first, 1938 and today, the false parallels. So as the tensions between Russia and Ukraine mounted, we've heard more and more people voice that we are looking at another episode of appeasement, and that in this case, Russia is the invader and the conqueror, and that Ukraine is the victim. And one of the most poignant statement was from Adam Kinzinger: "We can retreat to the from the Sudetenland and hope he doesn't intend to rebuild all of the Soviet Union." The unsubtle implication is that Vladimir Putin is Adolf Hitler, that the Donbass is Sudetenland, and the Ukraine is the Czech Republic. And so the further implication is that we should feel justified to confront Russia militarily if need be, because otherwise we're looking at the conquest of Nazi Russia of the whole world. The presentation that I will give you today is based on principally on two books. First of it, one is Conjuring Hitler by Guido Giacomo Preparata, who the book, if you guys haven't read it, it's an utter complete masterpiece. I cannot, it gets 10 out of 10 from me. And the other one is Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. Quigley's book is most famous for the quote, which is often shared today in many articles, and it says that the powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The growth of financial capitalism made it possible for centralization of world economic control and the use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and direct injury of all other economic groups. Sacrifice of Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia came about in 1919 after the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart. Czechoslovakia would turn out to be the wealthiest, most prosperous, best administered country that came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here we can just see a few pictures of Prague in 1938. And as you can see, it's a real country, a developed place. So you can see the number of cars there on the street, clean streets. It was a prosperous, good place. The problem in Czechoslovakia is that it had a large proportion of its population was German-speaking population. They lived in the districts colored in red here. What you see here is not all of Czechoslovakia, but just the Czech Republic, Czechia now, the Sudetenland and Bohemia and Moravia in this picture. So in the 1930s, the German-speaking population started to increasingly agitate for greater autonomy, greater rights. And in 1934, with funding from Nazi Germany, a Czech Nazi party was formed under the leadership of Konrad Henlein. That's that guy. The president of the country was Edvard Beneš. Basically, Czechoslovakia had fairly advanced provisions for minority population, which in addition to Germans was also included Hungarians and Slovaks and Poles in different regions of the country. But nevertheless, the Germans led by the Nazi party were increasingly agitating, and to the point where it became a source of destabilization for the country. In 1934, Czechoslovakia banned the Nazi party, but they merely renamed it Sudeten Party of the Germans, or Sudeten German Party, and they continued to agitate in coordination with the Nazis in Berlin. So the history as we learned it at school was that Germany started low-intensity undeclared war in Czechoslovakia on 17 September 1938. At that point, UK, France formally asked Czechoslovakia to cede territory to Germany, and from that resulted Appeasement, which was ill-advised but well-intentioned to prevent a greater war from breaking out on the European continent. At that time, the memories of World War I were still fresh, and the idea of going to war again between major powers was a major obstacle to foreign policy making. The fear of a powerful German military and weak defenseless Czechoslovakia is what made the appeasement possible. However, that fear was pumped up by the media and by the British intelligence and foreign policy establishment, although it was completely false. So as we'll see, the military balance in 1938 was quite different from what most people believe. So German military in 1938 had 35 infantry divisions, of which only 22 partially trained divisions were near the Czech borders. They had only 4 motorized divisions, and none of them fully manned or equipped. Almost all of Germany's tanks were below 10 tons, armed with 37mm guns, with only a handful of 18-ton Mark III tanks. At the same time, twice the same. At the same time, Czechoslovakia's military in 1938 had 34 well-equipped infantry divisions capable of. The country was capable of mobilizing fully 1 million troops. They had hundreds of 38-ton tanks with 75mm cannons, and they also had a very well-trained Harmoral army with extensive, powerful border fortifications. They also had strategic alliances with France and the USSR. In terms of this quote is from Quigley. In terms of quality armaments and fortification, the Czech army was known to be the best in Europe and was superior to German army in every way except for air support. They also and here's a photograph of the fortifications all along the Czech borders that the eventual Nazi invasion would have to reckon with. The British military attaché in Prague, in a cable to London in September 38, said that there are no shortcomings in the Czech army as far as I have been able to observe. So this is a very qualified judgment of the Czech military capability at that time. So Hitler's intent to invade Czechoslovakia led to a revolt of German generals who fully appreciated that attacking Czechoslovakia would have been suicidal. So on 21 April 1938, Hitler ordered General Wilhelm Keitel to draw up plans to invade Czechoslovakia. That's the source of the consternation in the highest echelons of German military was based on. So a group of generals of the German Army High Command, clustered around General Ludwig Beck, who was the chief of the General Staff, actually prepared to have Hitler assassinated in 1938. They created a plan which was communicated to the British and to various other diplomatic missions around Europe. First, they tried to dissuade the Führer from taking action against Czechoslovakia. Second, they demanded that Britain stand firmly by Czechoslovakia and to warn Hitler that Britain would oppose any action taken against Czechoslovakia. And if none of that worked, the assassination was planned, and the date for the assassination was set for 28 September 1938. We'll look at this British secret diplomacy around this affair. As Carol Quigley noted in Tragedy and Hope, in general, the key to everything was the position of Britain. What's important to keep in mind that at this time, Britain really was the dominant diplomatic power in the world. They had all the finance was flowing through London. They still had firm control of the trade routes around the world. And even though they were a former empire, in general, all the governments in Europe deferred to Great Britain in their geopolitical positioning, and they basically sought a green light from London before any major foreign policy decision was formulated and taken. This is in a way very similar to the position of the United States today. There's basically countries who are under the American sway do not dare to take any significant action without the green light from Washington. So the stewards of British foreign policy at the time were a small handful of people around the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and they were Lord Halifax, primarily Foreign Affairs Secretary, Viscount Walter Runciman, Sir Samuel Hoare, Sir John Simon, Sir Neville Henderson, who was the British ambassador to Prague, and Sir Horace Wilson. He was the Home Civil Service Secretary. In the 1930s, it's important to understand that Germany, the Nazis, believed that the UK was their ally. They were by far their largest trading partner. The UK provided extensive but secret financial and trade support for German rearmament, together with the United States. Not so much official United States, but basically the banking establishment and a number of key large corporations. That is covered extensively by Anthony Sutton in Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, but it kind of goes well beyond of what we can cover today. The Nazis basically believed that they were allied with the United Kingdom in order to destroy communism together. And already in 1930, 1931, there were earnest preparations for the Operation Otto, which was later renamed Operation Barbarossa, and we all know what happened then. In March of 1936, Germany reoccupied the demilitarized buffer zone of the Rhineland in flagrant violation of the Versailles Treaty and an act of war. Britain, Italy, and Belgium were the guarantors, but the British tacitly supported the Hitler's move and failed to support France. Basically, the French defense forces, which were greatly superior to the invading Nazi troops, waited for London to give them an okay to confront the Nazis. But the okay never came. The British basically were saying, yeah, we'd like to preserve peace, so please don't react. And the French deferred to them and didn't react. The turning point towards in the escalation to World War II is believed to be Lord Halifax's mission to Adolf Hitler's Alpine residence in on 19 November 1937, where Lord Halifax delivered three key messages. That Britain considered Germany the bastion against communism in Europe, that Britain had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, and that Germany should refrain from using force to achieve her aims in Europe. This is explained by the larger agenda that British foreign policy establishment was pursuing, and that was the three-block global order, which was articulated specifically by Lord Halifax again after the Munich conference in 1938, in which he basically laid out that the Germany would serve as the dominant power on the continent with predominant rights in Southeastern Europe, that Britain would be dominating the Euro-Atlantic West in alliance with the United States, and that her Far Eastern dominions would be secured in alliance with Japan. So that was the three-block agenda. And then within this three-block agenda, the plan for Germany was explicitly formulated in their 7-point plan, which was communicated to the Germans after 1937 in various guises. But this is basically what gave the Nazis the conviction that the British had their back. So point one, Hitler's Germany was to be the frontline bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. Point two, a four-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany was to prevent all Russian influence in Europe, which was the ultimate objective. Accordingly, Britain had no desire to weaken the Rome-Berlin axis. Today, we're looking at something similar. Again, the desire to prevent all Russian influence in Europe. Point number three, Britain had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, as we already mentioned. Four, Germany must not use force to achieve her aims in Europe, as this could precipitate war in which Britain would have to intervene. With patience, Germany could achieve all its aims without using force. And here it's important to underscore that the aims was not a conquest of Europe, but strategic positioning and influence within Central and Eastern Europe. And this is what I reconstructed from this history, even though I didn't find any explicit mention of it. I think that the British had the idea that Germany would occupy Europe in a way that would give it strategic predominance, and then to kind of corral the rest of Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and other countries to orchestrate a large-scale invasion and destruction of Russia. Point number five, Britain wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the numbers and the use of bombing planes. Point number six, Britain was prepared to give Germany colonial areas in South Central Africa, including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola, a little bribe. Point number seven, Britain would use pressure on Czechoslovakia and Poland to negotiate with Germany and to be conciliatory to German desires. The plan for Czechoslovakia was presented by Lord Halifax, again, to Czech ambassador in London on 25 May 1938. So the plan was separation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, neutralization of the rest of Czechoslovakia by revising her treaties with Russia and France, basically means canceling those treaties, and an international guarantee of this from Czechoslovakia, although not by Britain. In essence, this is basically what was agreed by the four powers at the Munich conference in September 1938, except without any participation of Czech representatives. So it's just a little quote capturing the mindset of the British as it was perceived by their ally Japan. So Captain Arataoka, Japanese military attaché in Berlin, warned Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was a great Anglophile himself, Never forget that the British are the most cunning people on earth, and then they graduated to absolute masters in the art of negotiations, as well as in that of manipulation of the press and public opinion. And we'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. So, inducing panic at home, the word panic fell out of this title. To sell this plan for Czechoslovakia to the British public, which was viscerally opposed to Nazism, in May 1938, the British media kicked off a wholesale campaign of demonizing Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia was presented as an artificial monstrosity and as an aberration of 1919. Czechs were portrayed as hateful people who mistreat the German-speaking population, and the anxiety about the relentless German mobilization was also used to fuel war psychosis at home. Again, the idea was given that Germany could easily crush Czechoslovakia. The war psychosis escalated to fever pitch by September 1938. The Luftwaffe could imminently launch bombardments of Paris and London. The Germans might use poison gas ordnance. And so the result was a veritable panic and psychosis in the British society at the time, something similar to what we just lived through over the last 2 years of the pandemic. And so, as you can see in these photographs, the effects was very similar. They had stations around London where people could come and be fitted for gas masks. Children in schools were instructed on how to fit them on themselves. Some people, the normies, I guess, of the age, were taking the whole thing very seriously and used the mask sans provoque, or at least for the press photo ops. Children in schools were encouraged to use gas masks. The normies in public shopping were using the gas masks. And also the Brits were encouraged and compelled to dig trenches around the parks of London to prepare for the imminent invasion of the Nazis, as we can see in these photographs. This was the reality of British life in 1938, and the whole purpose was, of course, there was no risk of the Nazis invading or bombing London at that time, but nevertheless the public was whipped into a frenzy of fear and fully expected them. And the whole purpose of this was to kind of soften the public opinion for allowing Nazi Germany to basically take over and destroy Czechoslovakia. The children also were being evacuated from London to safe locations. The next stage was pushing Czechoslovakia to commit suicide. So Chamberlain's agenda was formulated in his own words. The idea of territorial cession would be likely to have a more favorable reception from the British public if it could be represented as the choice of the Czech government themselves, and it could be made clear that they had been offered the choice of a plebiscite or territorial cession and had preferred the latter. This would dispose of any idea that we were ourselves carving up Czechoslovak territory. The France and Germany then, in August and September of 1938, they ordered Czech government not to mobilize their troops for fear of provoking the Germans, and pressured Czechoslovakia to accept the Franco-British plan. The Franco-British plan was basically to cede territory to Germany, the Sudeten regions of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a vague, non-specific guarantee by international powers. So this was accepted with strong protest and rejection from Edvard Beneš, and the United Kingdom and France responded with even more pressure and France to push harder, threatened to revoke their alliance with Czechoslovakia. On 21 September 1938, the Czechs finally yielded to the UK and French dictate. What happened then is that Chamberlain himself went in person to visit Hitler at Bad Godesberg. So this is one day after the Czechs ceded to Franco-German, Franco-British plan. The very next day, Chamberlain rushes off to visit Hitler at Bad Godesberg with the good news. And there together they formulated the unacceptable Godesberg ultimatum. History records that this Godesberg ultimatum was simply Adolf Hitler's brainchild, but I find it virtually impossible to believe, because there would have been a reason why Chamberlain himself went to deliver the good news to Hitler. They could have used telegraph, they could have sent an attaché, they could have sent a messenger. Chamberlain went there in person, which suggests that there were strategic decisions to be made at that meeting. Another myth was that when Chamberlain went to Bad Godesberg, that he found Hitler frantic and in an extremely foul mood. But as the photograph you can see here suggests, he was quite not in a foul mood. He was quite jubilant about, the fact that he was getting Sudetenland for free without war. So the Bad Godesberg ultimatum was extreme. So yeah.
Sorry about that. It's okay now.
Okay. So as I said, most probably this was Chamberlain's own brainchild. Suddenly Hitler, after getting everything he wanted from the Czechs, suddenly he ups the ante and he demands self-determination, not only for the Germans, but also for Poles, Hungarians, and Slovaks. Why would Hitler want this? It's inexplicable. He also demanded that troops would enter Czechoslovakia before October 1938 and to occupy the territories to be determined at his own discretion. So this was obviously immediately rejected by the Czechs, but it was also rejected by the French. And the reaction of the Soviet was that they explicitly reiterated their commitment to the security concerns of Czechoslovakia. Well, to make all this, to make the public in the United Kingdom, but also in the rest of Europe, swallow all this, the next thing Chamberlain did was a spectacular con game that he enacted in London. So when he returned to London on 27 September, he gave a radio address to the nation, in which he basically feigned dismay about things going on in Europe. And here's his statement: "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." So no idea what's going on back there. The day immediately after he delivered this radio address, he sent a telegram to Czech President Beneš. Basically, he tells him that he has to accept Hitler's ultimatum by 2 p.m. the next day. So by 28 September at 2 p.m., or he would be crushed by the Nazi invasion. And right after he sent that telegram to Beneš, he sends a message to his buddy Adolf: "Let's do a 4-power conference," which Adolf Hitler accepted, and it was organized in Munich. The very next day, on 28 September, he gave a speech at the House of Commons at 3 p.m. The speech was the character of the speech was that it basically scared the daylights out of the members of parliament, who sat aghast, expecting the bombs to start falling on London any second. And then in a theatrical stunt towards the end of his speech, he was delivered a message in the House of Commons. And then he announced that it was an invitation to a four-power conference in Munich, which basically provoked cheering and great relief from the MPs. He only forgot to mention that he orchestrated that four-power conference himself. And so he ended his speech, and without the end to the session, he just rushed off to Munich to save the world. So this is how the whole episode was portrayed in the British press. So we go to Munich, 30th September 1938, where Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Edward Daladier basically carved up Czechoslovakia without consulting anyone, least of all the Czechs. The Czech representatives was kept waiting for 10 hours outside of the door of the conference, which was held at the Führerbau complex, which you can see here, charming building. And these are the participants: Neville Chamberlain, Francis Edward Daladier, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, who brought his, I think he was his nephew, Vital. Basically, what you can see in this picture is that it was really a cheerful gathering. Everybody looked happy and jubilant. They were going to prevent a large war in Europe. Upon his return, Neville Chamberlain gave his famous speech. My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. And here's the news as they reported it. One thing, the reason why I selected this photograph, because you'll see a funny thing in the left column below the title. It says 5,000 British troops would be sent to Sudetenland. Interesting. Today we have British troops have already been sent to Britain, and also a small contingent to Poland. And there's also British troops today in Estonia, commanding, I think, a battalion, if not a brigade. And so that was the treaty. So the provisions of the treaty, just to cover them in brief: German occupation of some designated areas of Czechoslovakia in several stages. The progress of the occupation would be overseen by an international commission. The joint Czech-German commission would order and supervise the plebiscites to guarantee the rights of ethnicities, because this was obviously very important to Hitler. There would be a 6-month grace period for migrations of people between the areas. There will be no seizure of or damage to the property by the occupying troops, and no damage to the infrastructures. And the rump Czechoslovakia, the remainder of Czechoslovakia, would be guaranteed by Britain, France, and Germany. Britain and France and Germany and Italy would be joining that guarantee after the Polish and Hungarian minority issues would be settled. Basically, the treaty was just a thin veil of diplomatic civility over the brazen destruction of a prosperous nation, with the objective of empowering the Nazi Germany. Before the ink could dry on the treaty, all of the key provisions were violated by Germany. The infrastructure was severely damaged, as every key highway and railway were damaged or blocked, collapsing the Czech economy. The International Oversight Commission simply just rubber-stamped every decision taken by the German General Staff. Poland and Hungary were rewarded for their neutrality with chunks of Czechoslovakia. Czech alliance with the USSR was abolished, and the Communist Party was banned. The plebiscites were simply forgotten, and the anti-Nazi refugees from Sudetenland were rounded up and handed over to the Germans to be liquidated. The stipulated guarantee was simply ignored, of course. So here we see the map of Czechoslovakia at the time. The olive green area is Germany. The lighter areas were the areas that Hitler immediately occupied on his discretion. The Hungary was rewarded with the green areas we see south in the south of Czechoslovakia and the eastern region, which was added later in March 1939, and Poland obtained the small area with Polish minority called Zalozhye. After Hitler overran Czechoslovakia, they captured a very large military arsenal, including 469 tanks that were vastly superior to German tanks, 1,500 planes, 43,000 machine guns, more than 10,000 rifles, and more. None of this was used in defense of Czechoslovakia. Basically, the results of Munich was that Hitler got everything he wanted and more, but without the cost and casualties of war. Nazi Germany was made into a supreme power in Central Europe, as Chamberlain and Halifax had planned. And that was not enough. So the episode continues because Hitler was not content with what he obtained. Basically, he felt cheated out of the war, and he moved to take all of Bohemia and Moravia. Hitler, after the conference in Munich, felt kind of betrayed by Britain. His statement was that this was his first and last international conference, and that he would not allow himself to be persuaded by any dirty pig out of a war. Basically, by dirty pig, he was referring to Neville Chamberlain. So on 14th March, Hitler summoned Czech puppet President Hacha to Berlin, forced him to sign documents handing over the country to Germany. Within a week, Bohemia and Moravia were declared German protectorate. Basically, the conventional history holds that these events of March 1938, so not the Munich Treaty, but Hitler's incursion into Bohemia and Moravia, were at long last revealed Hitler's true intention. But for Chamberlain and the British foreign policy establishment, who was orchestrating the affair, this merely represented a public relations challenge. So on 15th March, Chamberlain explicitly accepted Hitler's seizure of Bohemia and Moravia in the House of Commons and declined to accuse Hitler of bad faith. But on 17th March, he went to address his constituency in Birmingham, where he denounced Hitler's actions as illegal. However, at law, the British government accepted the seizure by accrediting the British consulate in Prague to Germany. So Prague was previously not taken over by Hitler under the Munich Treaty. This was done in March 1939. Nevertheless, almost immediately, without skipping a beat, the British recognized this at law. As the public outrage mounted, Chamberlain made some more empty gestures to pacify the people. On 28th March, he canceled the planned trade talks with the German delegation, but only 5 days later, the German commercial attaché in London was informed secretly that the British were ready to reopen the discussions. In May 1939, Bank of England chief Montagu Norman turned over 6 million British pounds of Czech gold reserves over to Nazis, and Chamberlain's government basically, when this became news, said that, well, there's nothing we can do because we cannot give orders to the Bank of England, which was basically a preposterous defense. But it served the purpose of softening the British public opinion. After the Czech episode, Hitler set his sights on Poland. He wanted the return of Danzig, which Germany lost after World War I, and a 1 kilometer strip of land to connect it to the mainland, to Germany. The talks with Poland kicked off on 31 October 1938. It was in a relatively cordial atmosphere. At the time, Hitler did not intend to overrun Poland, but rather to engage her as an ally in an onslaught against the USSR. Hitler was prepared to reciprocate Polish cession, but the Poles actually did not accept his proposals. So this is basically the map of the area. This is the Sudetenland and the corridor through which Hitler wanted a passage to connect Danzig with the mainland Germany. After his proposal was declined by the Poles, he reiterated his demands for Danzig and the corridor again in March 1931, but this time a little bit more assertively. But at that point, Chamberlain issued a unilateral, bizarrely worded guarantee to Poland. And I'll read it word for word because it's kind of important. Certain consultations are now proceeding with other governments in order to make perfectly clear the position of His Majesty's government. In the meantime, before those consultations are concluded, I now have to inform the House of Commons that during that period, in the event of any actions which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. So very convoluted statement, but if you dissect it, this is the first such guarantee issued from 1918. It's unilateral, it asks nothing in return from Poland. Furthermore, it gives Poland the privilege to declare when the guarantee should take effect, but it guarantees Poland's independence, not the territorial integrity, which basically gives open maneuvering space to the Nazis to actually go for Danzig and the corridor. This was not part of the guarantee, but at the time there was a lot of talk in the UK about 100 million British pound loan for Poland to go along with this, to fund this, the requirements under this guarantee. The effect of the guarantee was that it emboldened the Poles to harden their stance towards Germany, so they rejected Hitler's second overture as well. So Hitler was perplexed by this at first, but then when he learned of the British guarantee, the effect was that he promptly decided to attack Poland. On 23rd May 1939, he said, "The Polish problem is inseparable from the conflict with the West. Poland sees danger in a German victory in the West and will attempt to rob us of that victory there. There is therefore no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity." So the time set for invasion of Poland was before September 1939. In reality, in spite of the guarantee, Britain did next to nothing for Poland's security. They made no effort to build a defense front with Poland, and no arrangements were made for military cooperation between the UK and Poland in case of German invasion. The armaments Britain provided were sent too late in symbolic qualities and basically unuseful material. Of the 100 million loans that was talked about, only $8,163,300 in credit was issued, and only 1 month before the invasion. This is how Hitler perceived British guarantee, and he called their bluff, basically. The following is characteristic of England. Poland wanted a loan from England for rearmament. England, however, only gave a credit to make sure that Poland buys in England, although England cannot deliver. This means that England does not really want to support Poland. He shared this with his general staff on 22 August 1939, imminently before he was going to issue the orders to invade Poland. So at the same time, Britain continued to support the Nazis. So the rumor in London was that there was a 1 billion British pound loan for Nazi Germany, which is more than 100 times what the credit UK extended to Poland. These rumors were corroborated by Hitler himself, speaking about these events at a later date, which was in August 1942. So here's what Hitler said. Schacht had told me that we had at our disposal a credit of 1,500 million marks abroad, and it was on this basis that I planned my 4-year plan, which never caused me the slightest anxiety. And this is how things are today, and we never find ourselves blocked for money. In the end, Britain only signed a formal alliance with Poland in August 1939, the very day when Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. The move was only to pretend that Her Majesty's government opposed the Nazi Germany. And the fact which tells us that Britain could have stopped Hitler had they wanted to was that when Hitler actually learned of Britain's formal alliance with Poland, signed on the day of invasion, he immediately reversed his order and halted the invasion. However, the opportunity to sue for peace was again wasted, and only after a week's delay, invasion went ahead on the 1st September 1939. Only 27 days later, Britain's ally surrendered. During the Polish campaign, the Franco-British continued. During this campaign, during Hitler's invasion of Poland, where it was clear that they lost control of Hitler, the Franco-British contingent on the Western Front numbered 1.5 million troops, and Germany at the time only had 300,000. So they could have at that point attacked from the West, but they didn't. In fact, the Royal Air Force had strict orders not to bomb any of Germany's land forces, and this order stood in effect until April 1940. Britain could have blocked Germany's access to funding in London. Britain could have easily blocked naval trade for Germany, but they haven't done so. So, in effect, the Nazis were easily able to resupply their stocks from everywhere around the world. And basically, Nazis were very short on resources. So they largely depended on foreign trade for constant resupplies, which, by the way, passed largely through Suez Canal, which was controlled by Britain, but these shipments were never intercepted. Yeah, no financial blockade either. So in the end, what most people don't appreciate is that Britain only joined World War II in May 1944, when the USSR had already shredded the Nazi war machine at the cost of 27 million casualties. Britain wanted to see her two Eurasian rivals weakened and to see them ruin one another. So this is a quote from Guido Giacomo Preparata, Conjuring Hitler. Then and only then did Britain deem that the time had finally come to dispatch this Nazi creature, by now mortally wounded, that she had nurtured for over a quarter of a century for the sake of her Eurasian ambition. Another quote, just to throw it in there, this was spoken by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Winston Churchill in July 1936. If there is any fighting in Europe to be done, I should like to see the Bolsheviks and the Nazis doing it. Well, that's kind of exactly what happened. In the end, we'll just look at where the three-block agenda is today and where it comes from. So it originates, this is the map, right? Very similar to what Lord Halifax presented in 1938 after the Munich Agreement. We have the European region, we have the North American region, we have the Asia Pacific region. Basically, the European region, again, I think largely through the process of European integration, it was Germany that was being set up again as the hegemon in Europe. But today, as we know, Ukraine is the key piece of this puzzle of controlling the heartland and the world island. So the objective was originally formulated by Sir Halford Mackinder. I believe most of you know, who wrote that who ruled Eastern Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island controls the world. This virtually same strategy as the empire migrated its center of power from London to Washington and New York. This same strategy migrated together with it. And it was formulated by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 in his Grand Chessboard, where he says that for America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. Eurasia is the globe's largest continent and is geopolitically axial. A power that dominates Eurasia would control two of the world's three most advanced and economically most productive regions. About 70% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for 60% of the world's GDP and about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. So basically, this is why Eurasia is so important to the empire, not freedom and democracy of its people or human rights. And furthermore, Brzezinski says that the most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia or even to diminish significantly its decisive arbitration role. And the most recent explicit formulation of this very same obsession with dominating the Eurasian landmass was briefed to the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee as late as August 2018. Basically, it was done by Wes Mitchell, who at the time took over from Victoria Nuland as Undersecretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. At this briefing, Wes Mitchell said that the central aim of the administration's foreign policy is to defend US domination of Eurasian landmass as the foremost US national security interest and to prepare the nation for its challenge. He also mentioned that the administration was coordinating efforts in this area with our great ally, the United Kingdom, to basically to coordinate a group of nations to help them pursue this policy. And I just have to say that this is actually a misquote on my part, because what Wes Mitchell actually said in the quote that I have here on screen is not that the central aim was to defend US domination. What he actually said was to prevent the domination of Eurasian landmass from falling into the hands of a rival power. And I just kind of paraphrased it. So I wanted to make that clear that this is not a precise quote, but basically what it says here is what he said in different words. Somebody later alerted me to the fact that this quote is not precise. That's all. Thank you for for participating in this presentation, and I think that this concludes the formal part. In a perfect world, I would have written this whole script out. I would have proofread it. I would have rehearsed the presentation once or twice, but we're not in a perfect world, so it is what it is. Maybe we can make up for the clunkiness of my presentation in the Q&A session and discussion. I think. All right, I stopped sharing the screen now. There we go. That's all. Thank you, and I'm open to questions. I'm open to other people because I know that many of you know many of these things that I talked about, other facts, other bits of the puzzle. So, you know, let's spend the rest of the time talking about that.
Absolutely.
John, Alex, you raised
Thank
your
you
hand.
so
I
much.
think. Thank you. I saw John Alex raise his hand.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And we already have a list of names in the queue of people who have been itching to ask you a question. I've got a few questions in my mind that I'm going to withhold for a bit. You know what, you called on John? He wasn't the first in the queue, but I see that as maybe the will of God intervening and wanting John to ask the first question. So John, go for it. Oh, but yet you are on mute.
You're mute.
Thank you, Alex, for the presentation. I had unfortunately I didn't hear the first few minutes of your presentation, so I'm not sure if you mentioned this. The Soviet Union did attempt to protect to fulfill its obligations towards Czechoslovakia, but to do this they had to send troops through Poland, and they formally requested to Poland to allow them to send troops to protect Czechoslovakia. And Poland, because it was aligned with Germany at the time, since their 1934 mutual non-aggression treaty, categorically refused. And this essentially sealed Czechoslovakia's fate, because it could no longer be defended militarily. That's the first point I would like to mention. The second thing is, once the actual Munich Agreement, what it did is it meant that Germany didn't actually have to invade Czechoslovakia. Between Bavaria and Czech Republic today, of course, there's still the same mountains that were there back in 1938. In 1939. So it would actually have been a very difficult military endeavor.
Well, it would have been, my understanding is that it would have been impossible endeavor because the terrain is extremely difficult. The Czechs had very strong fortification and they had superior army, and their army was very well organized, very well trained, very high morale.
Possibly the best in Europe.
That's right. And this was very well appreciated by the German general staff, which is why they thought the whole thing was suicidal, and they wanted by all means to dissuade Hitler from doing it. They engaged in a very sustained effort in August and September of 1938 to reach the British diplomats and decision makers through the Vatican, through various diplomatic missions around Europe. But all this was systematically dismissed by the British representatives. They made various excuses why it's not, it wouldn't be opportune to do that. They said, like, well, we can help, but we would need to know who exactly is behind this plot. We need the people to come out, which would have been impossible, you know, because the General Beck, Weizsäcker, they all would have been killed immediately if they came out, you know. But the fact is that Neville Chamberlain did frantic footwork to shield Hitler from this conspiracy because they knew about the conspiracy. Right, and this is part of the reason why you know, they were in a hurry to get Czechoslovakia to accept the cession of their territory without any resistance, so that Hitler could say, okay, we're going in, but we don't have to fight a war. and that his generals would not kill him. But with regards to the USSR's intervention, basically they tried on several occasions. There was a very famous so when King George was put to sleep in 1936, Stalin sent General Tukhachevsky to London for the funeral, and on the occasion it was arranged that Tukhachevsky, who was the most celebrated Red Army general, he was actually seen as a threat by Stalin, who called him Napoleonchik. He was basically like a rock star in the Red Army. He went to London and he held a meeting with the British general staff, in which he gave them very precise numbers about German armaments, and he said the Germans are much weaker than you think. It would be relatively easy for us to go in, basically to neutralize, demilitarize, and denazify Germany. And he proposed an aerial bridge across Poland and Romania to supply additional armaments into Czechoslovakia and troops, and to basically do something similar to what the Russians are doing today in Ukraine. And so the British dismissed him. They basically said, yeah, he's overinflating the numbers. He's misunderestimating the to use George Bush word, the Germans. And so they basically listened politely and said, no, thank you, we're not interesting. Then Tukhachevsky flew to Paris and he tried to persuade the French. But the French basically said, we'd rather not rock the boat. They coordinated everything with the Brits. The Brits were telling them, don't rock the boat. 2 months after Tukhachevsky's meeting with the French generals, Hitler marched into the Rhineland, and then the French were aghast, but it was too late. Now it was too late. And so the last attempt was at some point in 1938, maybe August 1938, Stalin was proposing a conference in Bucharest, USSR, Britain, France, Italy, and Czechoslovakia, to hold a meeting and to form an alliance of all these powers to contain and hold in check the Germany. But basically their initiative was ignored. So at every step, every possibility to stop Germany, even at the point where, because the plans for Operation Barbarossa went on at least since 1931. In 1936, Germany already broke the Versailles Treaty and made an act of war against France by remilitarizing the buffer zone in the Rhineland. And everybody knew what Hitler was about. So at the point in 1937, 1938, when he was weak, he could have been demilitarized, disarmed, neutralized, and denazified. There wouldn't have been a World War II, except at every step, at every critical juncture, the British secret diplomacy made sure that Hitler was shielded, that his acquisition of power was unobstructed, and that this large coalition intended primarily to invade and destroy Russia could gather pace. Britain stood aside. They guaranteed the security of Czechoslovakia. They did nothing when Hitler invaded. They guaranteed Poland. They did nothing when Hitler invaded. And so I think that it's pretty obvious that this was their own creation, and that they only joined the fight against Hitler when Americans were already in, and it was clear that Hitler was broken beyond repair, the whole Nazi war machine. Okay, that's it. I'll stop so for other
Th-
questions.
Thanks for your knowledge. I'd forgotten some of these details.
Thank you very much.
I've got a question in from Peter who asked me to read it aloud to you. It's a twofold question. So the first part, simple to the point, it's what influence did the USA have as a nominal principal creditor unto UK and France in September 1938? So if there's anything you could say about that. And the second part is a little bit larger. He's asking, did Halifax's 1937 meeting with Hitler provide a precedent for false guarantees to create a later pretext for war against the guarantee recipient? I am thinking of Secretary of State Dean Acheson's public omission of Korea from the American sphere of strategic interests map, and then the war over Korea, which ensues in 1950, and American ambassador to Iraq, Gillespie's guarantees to Saddam on July 25th, 1990, assuring Saddam that U.S. had no issue with Iraq's dispute with Kuwait, and war ensued August 2nd, 1990, then Operation Desert Storm. That's the question.
Okay, well, you know, since my head is kind of crammed full of this presentation, this question overflowed, and most of the words just fell out of the other ear. So you're going to have to help me out.
Peter, what? Maybe Peter could ask it in his own words if he's able to. Is that Peter? Can you do that?
I can do that. Thank you, Matthew. Alex, thank you very much for that.
Sorry.
No problem. So my first question dealt with the time period which you addressed. And what influence did the United States, as nominally the principal creditor unto the UK and France, have over these proceedings in Munich? And the second question is, what was Joseph P. Kennedy, as the ambassador to Court of St. James, public position at that time, and what was President Roosevelt's response to that scene? I'm trying to place the chronology for his quarantine the aggressor speech at that time. It was either plus or minus a year. And then when I heard you describe Halifax's maneuver in 1937, okay, meeting with Hitler and working out the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, but then setting the stage for a trap to be sprung on Hitler, it immediately made me think of Acheson leaving out Korea from our strategic sphere of influence map in 49, and then invading, and then going to war in Korea in 50. And then there was an infamous meeting between the American ambassador, April Gillespie, and Saddam on July 25th, 1990, saying, hey, we have no problem with your, no issue with your dispute over Kuwait, over some diagonal petroleum drilling. And that guarantee took place on July 25th. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait took place on August 2nd. Then there was Operation Desert Shield, and then Operation Desert Storm to eject Iraq from Kuwait. And it looked like a false guarantee to give a later false justification for war in both the Acheson and Gillespie cases. Just connecting dots that may not be there, but I saw it.
Yeah. Well, I will agree with you. You know, like this model of foreign policy, you know, basically it's always pitting foe against foe, because you cannot control Eurasia militarily. So you always want to have weaker powers that you can pit one against the other. You know, in this case, I think that April Gillespie basically drew Saddam into a trap so that they could cut him down to size and they could justify an invasion. Going back to the American role in World War II, you know, it's a bit more complicated because the certain interests from the United States were very involved in building up Hitler and funding his war machine, knowing perfectly well what they were doing, because this was when this all started to come out. It was dismissed and like, yeah, like it's the capitalist short-sighted pursuit of profits, blah blah blah. But as it turned out, they knew exactly what they were doing. This business was not particularly profitable, and it was regarded as a higher order mission. And the higher order mission was the bankers' agenda, the three world agenda. And so, but this is private interests. This is the vested interests of the empire. This is not the US official policy. The US official policy is a bit more complicated, because in part you have these private interests infiltrated into the governments and co-opting the State Department and the Treasury Department and so forth. But then you also have the legitimate and fully vibrant democratic institutions of the United States who, so there was like a push and pull before the FDR could bring the United States into Europe, and that took the Pearl Harbor event. I think that some of you here might know more about that than I do. I haven't mapped this process out in any great detail.
Yeah, well, you brought up the writings of Carroll Quigley, and I think that that's a good starting point for anybody wanting to map out the British pedigree behind the fifth column operations that are deeply embedded inside of the USA, which has both a private, a public component to it, a military component, big time financial, and so Quigley is a good starting point, especially his Anglo-American establishment document, but also his massive opus, Tragedy and Hope, that you referenced at the beginning. I mean, for anybody wanting to map it out, that I would say skipping that is a big mistake. But yeah, it's complex, like you said, Alex, and to paint things from the standpoint of a U.S. foreign policy or a U.S. policy often oversimplifies the richness of this internal struggle within the U.S. I've got the next question here from Bob regarding the coup attempt against Hitler. Bob, go for it.
It was more or less answered when Marty sent a message on it. Yeah, I was wondering about that coup. According to Marty, those generals didn't die. So I was wondering whether it was a case of a tip-off if they did, but if they didn't die, then evidently there was no repercussions, so they couldn't have been a tip-off.
Yeah, they didn't die, and in fact, they remained in their positions, because I think that the assassination attempt simply didn't go ahead. And the reason why it didn't go ahead is because the Czechs were under intense pressure to cede territory, because the British were saying, the British pretty much told Hitler that they could pressure the Czechs into accepting any kind of settlement that they impose on them, so long as Hitler committed to not taking Czechoslovakia by force, the Sudetenland by force. And so I think that the hope that this is how it was going to play out kind of diffused the general's intent to go through with the assassination. So apparently there was no tip-off. Apparently everybody's head remained on their shoulders in that particular assassination attempt. But
if I could ask you one other thing, Alex, here. I recently read Tragedy and Hope, and there's a characterization of the Russians that seems to have carried through. That's one area where he seems to go along with the idea that they're incapable of any kind of a democratic government. He seemed to have bought into that theory that we have now. It's just like saying that the U.S. is incapable of democracy because they genocide the Indians, or it's kind of a stereotype that was built into the book. Otherwise, it was a great book, and Alex, you got all those major points in that you came across with.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't, I think that this borderline racism, maybe it's racism, plain simple, against Russia is something that seems to have been cultivated in the West quite extensively. And I honestly, I know people in the hedge fund world who are, you can say what you want about hedge fund managers, but generally, their business depends on them understanding what's going on in the world. That's where they spend the bulk of their time. So generally in these discussions, you're going to encounter much more intelligent views about geopolitics and everything. But I still find,
I see that on Seeking Alpha, they have some interesting. You must be familiar with the Seeking Alpha.
Yeah, I don't spend much time on Seeking Alpha because I don't do stocks so much. I'm more focused on commodities. But basically, I still encounter this Russia derangement syndrome, and they'll latch onto these little, I don't even know what to call them, these little phrases like, yeah, Russians are not capable of strategic thinking because Spassky wasn't even capable of beating Fischer in chess. And then they'll latch onto that. And it's like, yeah, that, And so this thing moves, they grasp at any straw and they say like, Putin has been very effective. They understand that it's not like they're, like this nonsense that they're feeding us through the media. But still, there's like this thing of like, yeah, Russians are different, and they're different in an inferior way. They're kind of brutish and kind of react to stuff. They don't think things through. They can't plan. I can't explain it, but it's there. Yeah. And I hope that we're going to sober up and understand that they're people just like us, because they are, except maybe they haven't, been infected with this woke hysteria, with this, like 76 genders stuff and everything else that we've been having crammed down our throats last 20 years, maybe longer.
Amen.
Okay, thank you.
Jerry.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Oh, thank you very much, Alex, for a wonderful presentation, especially the part where you talk about the 3-block agenda, and you have that quote at the end, I think the British Prime Minister, where he wanted to see the Russians and Germans, kill each other, and then the British Empire would come in at the end and take over everything. That's always been my outlook too on World War II. That was the British Empire's plan from the first step, have the Germans and Russia. And also in the Pacific, have the Japanese and the Chinese fight each other, and the empire would step in later. So I thank you very much for that concept, because it it helps reinforce my confidence in it too.
Thank you.
My question, similar to what Peter was talking about, Lord Halifax, November 1937, when he goes to meet Hitler, and you said it was a turning point. Now, from the standpoint of Canadian history, I don't know if you know this, but that's my question. 6 months before Halifax went to visit Hitler, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King, went and met Hitler. And I can find very little information about it. He says in his notes, Hitler was a nice guy, friendly guy, but he's just a German peasant. That's how he thinks. And I know the Canadian Prime Minister, Roosevelt used him as a go-between with the British. And the British also used him as a go-between to Roosevelt. But let's be honest, the Canadian Prime Minister isn't going to take a glass of water without asking the British which glass he should drink of, But I was just interested, do you know of that meeting between Mackenzie King and Hitler and what you think it may have fed in with the British plan and maybe they were feeding disinformation to Roosevelt? I don't know. I just was interested on your take on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not aware of that meeting, so I couldn't tell you what I think about it. However, Canada is and has been part of the British Empire, and so clearly, Canadian ruling establishment is going to work in coordination with the British ruling establishment, and the Hitler. I read in Anthony Sutton, Hitler was deliberately kind of recruited already in the 1920s, not by the British so much, but by the German industrialists, exactly for his kind of inclination to fanaticism. And this they explained as follows, because a lot of these industrialists were developing their empires based on American and British investments and technologies. And so at the time in the 1920s, when they found Hitler and when they thought like, this is our guy, one of their concerns was that Germany owed massive debts to France for reparations, World War I reparations. And so their concern is that, like if we develop our industry here in Germany, we don't want all our proceeds to be taxed away so that Germany could pay back the French. So we need somebody who's like so nationalistic, who's so grieved by the injustices done in the past, that he's just going to go and tell these people to back off and that they're not going to honor those commitments. And so, Hitler and the Nazis fitted the bill. So they didn't need somebody like President Hindenburg or a reasonable, educated, learned gentleman. They needed, a rough, fanatical thug, and that's what they got, which also blew in their face, because they actually, this is my interpretation, what comes back to me from looking at all these little pieces of the puzzle. I think that Hitler was supposed to take a bit of Poland in peace, not run over Poland, cultivate Poland as an ally, and then jointly invade USSR, rather than allowing USSR and Germany to both move into Poland and to basically shred it. So that's where they lost control of him, and now this whole war machine was disunited and was going to prove less effective than what the Brits were hoping for. But being the fanatical thug that Hitler was, he wanted the war glory, he wanted conquest. He actually meant what he believed in, the myth of the great German nation and, all this, rather than accepting the role of a servant to the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Monty, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Yes, just curious, Alex. Thank you very much for your presentation. I've been very fascinated with this whole Operation Gladio that both Cynthia and Matt have been addressing, and how that appears to be still a modus operation presently. But in relationship to that, I was also fascinated by a reference in the LaRouche circles some years ago, and I haven't heard much of it since, about this supposedly intelligence out of the U.S. Army intelligence during World War II, that there existed a synarchist network. Are you familiar with such, and could you elaborate further on that if you are? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I looked into the Operation Gladio some years ago. I'm not exactly up to date with that. I know that it's a real thing. I know that in some guys it's probably there still, and I think, you know, when you have all these terror attacks in Europe, that's probably where it's coming from. I know that there's been, over the last few years, you know, like there's been cases where Italian police caught large shipments of weapons going to Belgium, where there was also a large number of immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. So I thought, oh, okay, so that's a new Operation Gladio 2.0 happening. But I don't know that I can give you a better answer to this question. That maybe, I don't know if Cynthia is on this call, but maybe Matthew could answer it better than me.
Well, Cynthia just had to run out, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay. Too bad. Do you know
the
answer to that? Do you know the answer to that question? Because I'm also curious.
Well, on the first part, on the synarchy material, I highly recommend the writings of Pierre Baudry. He made his books freely available on the synarchy. From he goes back to Count Joseph de Maistre as a Freemasonic controller of Napoleon back in the 19th century, late 18th century, and the rise of this of the heart and soul of the synarchy all the way through the 19th century, and he really spends a lot of time focusing on its manifestation or expression in the 1920s and 30s. The word itself was formulated. This was a file in the, I think it was the OSS, had American intelligence operations, which were a little bit more patriotic at that time, especially in the 40s, had a dossier on the synarchy, which was essentially the Anglo-French bankers and industrialists, along with their American counterparts, who were sponsoring the rise of fascism as an economic solution that they were trying to push to the woes of the Great Depression. So this was very well mapped out, and there are still surviving dossiers that haven't been destroyed, though many were, from the archives. So most unfortunately of those intelligence officers within the USA who had mapped this out were purged with the destruction of the OSS and the purging of all of FDR's allies from the institutions of the US. Anybody who had a security clearance, basically, who understood this, were not allowed to keep their jobs unless they played by a new set of rules. After World War II, obviously Gladio is a big thing, and that's a whole discussion, probably a whole presentation that we have to do unto itself in terms of how this thing shaped Operation Gladio. And I'm sure Cynthia would be more than happy to go through that, as her part 5 is now finally going to be published this week or so. But yeah, it's crazy story. I don't know if is that okay, Monty?
Yes, most helpful, Matt. Most helpful. I've been fascinated by the question and just trying to do a deeper dive. And this question of cynicism, I wasn't sure. I've heard reference to it, but I wasn't sure as far as the direction to go to.
I'll send you Pierre Baudry's books online as a PDF. It's a wonderful resource, really rich stuff.
Thank you.
Sure. I know Satomi's been waiting for a while with a thought to share. Is Satomi still there?
Oh, hi. Well, thank you, Alex. And, you really see how important it is to understand history, to really come, especially I'm thinking of Czechoslovakia, because I had an older man. He was an architect that lived in the building, and he was always so angry and bitter, and especially like the Catholic Church. But and he was writing this thing about World War II, and I could now understand, like he didn't totally understand, but you see that kind of anger that they don't know where to direct it at, because it's, nothing's really clear. And then I have another Czech friend, and he had a crystal store, and I remember being there one time, and this Czechoslovakian lady came in, and she was again angry at what happened, the Nazis did to her family and her neighbors, and then she had a son that was never totally right. Like, you see just the devastation of what goes on with the ordinary people affected by all this kind of game that these, just like that Japanese ambassador said, the British were so cunning, and it was, it's just so tragic, and hope. That's really what it's about. You made me really see that with, Czechoslovakia, because that's such a classic example. And I think Netanyahu blatantly said, I think, that Israel will not become another Czechoslovakia. Well, of course, nobody understood what that meant, except unless you understood your history. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, because I'm from Croatia, and we had a war in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And at the time, I was a young man in my 20s. I volunteered for the military service during that war. And I can also tell you that same thing. It took me maybe 20 years to work out what I volunteered for. And had I understood that, I would not have volunteered. I would, it's again one of these manipulations of foreign powers that led to that war, which never needed to happen. But then once it does happen, you have this whole war psychosis building up. And then you have young people who go like, oh my God, our country is under attack. We volunteer, we go fight. Except it's the wrong thing. And I think that the only thing that can keep us from sleepwalking into these conflicts again is to understand the process that generates these conflicts, and to understand that it's not, David Attenborough apparently had the perfect analogy for this. And it's one of those memes that's been going around the internet, that I don't know if it's genuinely from him, but basically what it says, that if you put a bunch of black ants and red ants into a jar and you close the jar, nothing happens. These ants just go around for whatever reason. But then if you shake up the jar violently, then the ants start fighting between themselves, and then you have the war between reds and the blacks. And so rather than us turning against the other, we need to understand who's shaking the jar, and we have to understand that somebody's shaking the jar, and say like, wait a minute, let's not fight. Let's see if we can push back against these people who want us to fight.
Yes. Oh, and also, like, I never knew, like, Helmut was his name. And then Wes said to Václav, said, oh, he was a German, he was German Czechoslovakian. But you would never know that, because you would think he was so loyal to Czech. He loved Czechoslovakia. And, things like that, you when you hear things firsthand, and also how very prosperous Czechoslovakia was, and just the tragedy of that destruction of a country like that. And then Germany wouldn't probably not have been as prosperous if the Czechs were able to unfold as they were.
Yeah, or maybe they would have been more prosperous if they didn't, squander their nation's wealth and manpower for fighting wars.
Yeah. Well, these are just things that, when we're ignorant of history, just so much how
Yeah,
important
I
I think
think-
it shows you. And I thank you. And of course,
Yes, I think that's exactly what we're trying to cure here,
yeah, we won't repeat
Thank
it.
you. Thank
Thank
you very
you.
much.
Yeah, a little inoculation from fascism. It's good, good. The only shots we support, shots of truth. Now, let me ask you this. How much time do you have left? I've got a couple more questions in queue.
No, let's go. I'm it's my day is ending. It's 10 to 10
Of
in
course.
the evening. So I'll nobody's waiting for me.
Perfect. All right. In that case, Mark asked me to read his question aloud to you. He says, to what extent would Hitler have been aware of the financiers' plan to use Germany to destroy the USSR? Was there ever a point where control of Hitler as their stooge was lost? I think
Sorry, was there ever
a point where control of Hitler as their stooge was lost, which I think you've been sort of addressing throughout your presentation. But yeah, and the first part was, to what extent would Hitler have been aware of the plan to use Germany to destroy the USSR?
Yeah, I think that Hitler was fully aware of that. And I think that Hitler genuinely hated the communists, hated the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And I think that he was fully on board with the idea of destroying them. I think that, no, I don't, not that I think, I also know that there was already then an obsession with overpopulation, and Hitler bought into that. And he also believed that Germany has to basically he had kind of Ukraine in mind. Germany needed to conquer larger territories to accommodate Germany needed the Lebensraum to accommodate for the large population, so that the Germans could migrate eastwards and create a greater Germany. So the whole thing kind of worked for him, both as becoming the dominant power in Europe, extending Germany's Lebensraum to accommodate for the overpopulation, and at the same low price to also smash the odious Russians. When did they lose control over him? I think that so first of all, we know that Hitler deeply resented the Munich Treaty. And apparently he resented it because it deprived him of a war. He wanted to smash the Czechoslovakia, and he wanted a war. He wanted to fight a war. I don't know. I guess he thought that was a glorious way to do it. And when it came to taking over Danzig and the corridor, I think he thought, what the hell, I'm just going to do this my way. And then when he learned that the Chamberlain issued that convoluted guarantee of Poland, that's where he snapped and just broke the chain and went his own way, and decided there and then that he was going to invade Poland and destroy it. And so I think I think maybe British guarantee of Poland is exactly that juncture. So what's that? What are we talking about? The dates, I think we could put a date on that. That's 21 March 1939. 21 March 1939.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Just a little follow-up question. This is Mark here.
Hi, Mark.
Why would Hitler have wanted or have been so anxious to go into Czechoslovakia if there was this disparity between the two militaries, if the Czech was such a powerful military and potentially more powerful in Germany. And that's my only question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think that Hitler was primarily an ideologue and a fanatical one at that, you know. Maybe he, you know, that was German population that was the majority in the areas. Maybe he thought it was, maybe he underestimated the difficulty of conquering those areas because he thought that's our people there. Maybe they'll, you know, maybe they won't fight. I can't really tell you why, but you know, his generals were clearly at odds with his thinking in this respect, even to the point of mutiny, even to the point of assassinating him. What was it in his head that he was going to run roughshod over their opinions, over their advice? It would be very hard to say, but maybe just because he was exactly the kind of fanatical thug that he was recruited for.
Great answer. Thank you.
It's this question of ideology is very important, I think. Yeah. I mean, because people think, well, like everything is about logical self-interest and balanced, you know, the equations and parameters are all balanced before decisions are made in every big decision. And no, not really. Not always. And I mean, you saw the example of the German, I forget his position, but he was like essentially the commander of the German Navy, was it? Who was forced to resign when he basically, you know, gave a speech in India just a few months ago saying, look, Crimea, we have to accept it's not coming back to Ukraine. This is Russian. And, you know, threw a big wrench in the gears of this whole NATO war machine, pushing on the borders and pushing for a war with Russia. And that wasn't a little deal. Like that was a real point of intervention that he made, representing a very big chunk of the German military thinking, who knows that a world war with Russia is insane. The NATO countries should not ever fight this. It could only be justified by an ideological, the reasoning for it could only be found in an ideological source. It's not purely like a thought through self-interest that underlies the decision to risk a war with Russia. Maybe it has something to do with, like you said, that idea of ideology.
Well, so yeah, the guy you were citing was a vice admiral of the German Navy. His name was Kai Achim Schombach.
Yeah,
that was 22 January of this year. But okay, I think that at lower rungs of conflicts, you know, politics, academia, militaries, media, people. Conflicts are almost always irrational, you know, like when they cooked up the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, they went and pitted nationalities, you know, Croats against the Serbs, against the Muslims, and they use religion as well. Oh, look, these are Catholics, these are Orthodox, these are Muslim, and so you start feeding this psychosis and this information into the public, where one side starts to feel threatened by the other. And I've seen this in former Yugoslavia. All of a sudden, you start seeing in the daily newspapers, in the weekly magazines, all these stories about how Croats killed so many Serbs and about how Serbs did this. In Serbia, this was going on. It was over the top. It was like nonstop, everyday stories about World War II war crimes committed by Croats against the Serbs, which really did happen, except in 1990, they were not really our biggest problem. They were even not our 100th biggest problem. Nevertheless, this starts getting systematically pumped into the public discourse. And then it leads these minorities to start feeling really threatened, and then you have revolts and social uprisings, and then it culminates when somebody sparks a real conflict. However, I think that at the very highest echelon of power, that the thinking is extremely rational, because the empires, British, now whatever, American, the empire's imperative of dominating the Eurasian landmass is exactly what Zbigniew Brzezinski says. It's where most of the world's wealth is, where most of the world's population is. You know, you can't do much with resources unless you can use the local population to extract and transform and ship it for you. So you need large populations as well. For us here in the West, that doesn't make much difference. You know, whether we pay for our gas to Exxon or to Gazprom, it's all the same. We have to pay. It's not like if US dominates Eurasian landmass that we get stuff for free. Well, you know, not really. But to the bankers, it matters a great deal, because that all that stuff, the labor force, the resources, the enterprises, it constitutes money, good collateral. So if they control this, then they could, you know, increase their creation of capital, of credit. And that is direct benefit to themselves, because every dollar of credit that they issue, particularly to enterprises that they control, you know, so instead of Gazprom, you have Exxon and BP and Shell and so forth, exploiting the energy resources on the continent. You get, first of all, you own and control those companies, you get the dividends, but more importantly, you collect the interest on those credits, and you conjure those credits out of thin air based solely on the fact that there's collateral over there. So that's it, you know, like there's oil in Russia. Now it's Gazproms and Rosnefts and so forth, Russian companies that are exploiting it and benefiting from it, and Russian banks that are financing. So the bankers in London and New York don't really like this arrangement. They want, that's their resources as far as they're concerned. But of course, if they try to give us this rationale for war, everybody's going to say like, no, I'll pay gas at the pump to Gazprom, all the same to me. But for them, it's not the same. So they have to talk about freedom and democracy and human rights and, you know, what have you. I don't even know anymore. Gay rights, all of that stuff. And they have to demonize the other side, and they have to tell us how Russians are inferior and aggressive and violent and incapable of strategic thinking. And Spassky couldn't beat Fischer and so forth, even though Karpov did beat Fischer in the end, except they skip over that fact because not so convenient. But anyway, you know, like to wrap up the whole thing, the irrationality of conflict is being pumped into the masses, and everybody who's supposed to participate in it, including the media, including the academia and so forth. But up at the top, where the agenda is set and where the strategy is being formulated, I think that the objectives of war are very rationally based.
Well said. Rick, if you are still on, could you ask your question? Rick, are you there? Okay, let's go to, I might have to read Rick's question, but I'll wait on that. John Alex, if you're still there, you can ask your question. John,
yes. I do have one question, which it's more about today's events. You work in the financial world. What is the implication of payment in rubles for the world financial system?
Okay, well, first of all, the payments are controlled by Russia, so they go into Gazprom bank accounts, so they cannot be seized by European banks and American banks if they decide another round of sanctions and they say like, okay, like you got this money for the sales of natural gas. Well, guess what? Now you don't have it anymore. We freeze those accounts. Gazprom Bank is not going to freeze those accounts. But I think at a higher level, I think it also that those like that money, if it goes to European bank, then it can collateralize to the benefit of the European banks and American banks and whatever. If it goes to Russia, it collateralizes on their side, and it also bolsters the demand for rubles in the world. Okay. So it's at several levels. It's very important for Russia, and also extremely important for the foreign, for the other side, for the empire banks, to try to squelch that arrangement. And when Vladimir Putin announced that unfriendly countries would have to pay for their gas imports in rubles, Mario Draghi was one of the first one who jumped up and said like, no, that's unacceptable. He cried, blackmail, breach of contract and all of that. But in the end, like last Sunday, a week ago, he was in Washington and he had to say like, hey, guess what? Everybody started opening accounts in rubles, and there's nothing much we can do about that. So that he even went into this like whole bizarre discourse about how it's not really breach of sanctions because they didn't really define what sanctions are. So it's not clear that these companies are breaching any sanctions, even though like they announced them. And Ursula von der Leyen goes and warns companies not not to do this.
But in English, we say Ursula von der Leyen.
Oh, is that what her name is? I thought it was von der Leyen.
No. But in German you say von der Leyen, but in English we say von der Leyen.
Oh, okay.
The same thing.
Yeah, they try to kind of browbeat companies outside of any legally enforceable arrangement to boycott Russia. But what are the businesses supposed to do? Do they just put the key in the door, fire everybody, and say like, okay, that's it, I guess we're not operating anymore? Like these sanctions were estimated that they will lead to collapse of 60% of German manufacturing and 70% of Italian manufacturing. Obviously, people are going to push back because it's just suicidal. Like we would have to use our bodies to teach Putin a lesson. Freeze to death, starve to death, commit suicide to punish him. People are not going to go with this.
Mm-hmm. But do the European elite, are they simply idiots, or do they have some kind of demonic plan that somehow punishing so-called their own population at some point they think that they will win?
I think they're clearly idiots, and I mean, I'm not even, like I'm not even being particularly glib about saying this, but I have paid close attention. I like very much to listen to the other side. I like to listen to their speeches and interviews because very often, they end up saying more than they intended to say. So you pick up a lot of insights by listening to them. But I must say that having listened to them, I put myself through hundreds of hours of doing that. The more I listen, the more I come to the conclusion that they really are idiots. And like you can have a PhD and still be an idiot. And I think that maybe that's how they come to these very high positions of power, because as idiots, they are easier to manipulate. They're easier to sell a bill of goods to, and they don't have a problem of coming in front of the camera and lying to the public. And so I don't know. I think that they are, in part they're compromised. And I think that in part they also maybe believe in what they're doing because they're brainwashed in some kind of a ideology of look at us, human rights and climate change, saving the planet, like they're all saving the planet. And so they feel that they're justified maybe in what they want to do. I think that they just kind of regret that the public is not sufficiently aware of it, but, with education and information and keeping the disinformation and misinformation in check by the new Ministry of Information, Ministry of Truth, maybe they think they can muddle their way through to victory and then be redeemed and justified. I don't know. If I put myself in their heads, that's all I can come up with.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Before we round it out, Marty, I got to know, knowing your mind, I'm sure you got a lot of thoughts that have been bubbling up under the surface. Do you have any question or thought you'd like to throw out there before we close it up for tonight? But you are on mute, of course, so we can't hear you.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah.
I won't stay on. Usually, if one asks questions, especially if you're Irish, it's to disagree. The comments I want to make are quite the opposite. Apart from Alex's outstanding presentation, your summary at the end, Alex, is uncannily. Oh, I just have to echo it. I came for the same reasons as you, as a working journalist in Washington and covering Moscow and London and Paris and Berlin for 36 years now. And my considered, deeply established conclusion about the way the elites think is yours. I came to not only to the identical conclusion that you have done, but I came by the same route you did, by listening to people, by watching their body language, by seeing what is done and why it is done. So right. I'd like to add a couple of points to your marvelous presentation on the developments toward 38-39. And again, not to contradict anything you have said, but to embellish and confirm them. And the reason why I want to is to pass this on to you and to everyone else here, to Matt and Cynthia and Jerry and all of them, because this was given to me. My teacher at Oxford was in the heart of these events. He was the late Professor Hans Schenk, Czech, S-C-H-E-N-K. He was in his 20s a member of the democratic, genuine democratic movement in Czechoslovakia, and he escaped murder by the Nazis on the literal last plane out of Prague in March 1939. He later became Dean of Wolfson College, Oxford, and one of the leading experts on Central European history of that generation. He was my teacher. And he had several extraordinary insights into this. First, he was 100% convinced that Chamberlain and Halifax and the people around them were determined to support Germany as a weapon to destroy the Soviet Union. That was what they were after the word go. And they miscalculated. Hitler got out, was never in their control. It was a myth that he was. Hitler never himself was anyone in control. But that's the first point. The second point is that Czech was an unusual man. He was an aristocrat on his mother's side. His grandfather had been the personal private secretary to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand up to the assassination that started World War I in 1914. His mother's father. And he himself was the lifelong close personal friend of the political philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin in Britain. So this is a brilliant, experienced, well-connected man. He was two other things too. He was a devout Zionist supporting the existence of the state of Israel, and he was also a devout Catholic in the pre-Vatican II Church. That was an unusual combination for the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He was both. The reason I go to this is when we discuss Hitler, Schenck was convinced that Hitler was demoniacally possessed and was the personal tool of Satan on earth. He literally believed this. This is a leading professor of history at the University of Oxford. And he was not widely supported in these views at Oxford. They were skeptical about him. He was a very isolated figure in the last 15 years of his life, which is one of the reasons he opened up to me. Coming from Ireland, of course, I'm much more comfortable with what Matt was talking about, with the irrational in history, what Schenck would have called the demonic. And Schenck had many personal stories about the impact that Hitler had on individuals. For example, Randolph Churchill was once asked, did he not think it was a tragedy that his father, Hitler's great adversary, Winston Churchill, never had a chance to meet him face to face? You know, in high noon terms, you would dream of seeing it, the two great arch enemies meeting. And Randolph Churchill said, no, he believed it was divinely providential that the two men never met. And they nearly did in 1932. Churchill was in Munich, and he knew Hitler was the rising dark force. Hitler already intuited Churchill was his most dangerous adversary for all his other many faults in Britain. And Churchill was willing to meet, and there were go-betweens setting up the meeting. But it was Hitler who had cold feet and who pulled out. He backed down, he was scared of Churchill. But Randolph thought that because of Hitler's demoniac powers, he might have been able to weaken Churchill and hypnotize him the way he ran rings around Lloyd George and Chamberlain and these other individuals. Secondly, Chamberlain, and the British historian I think who grasps this best, was actually American, was the late William Manchester in volume 2 of his huge biography of Churchill. He points out that Neville Chamberlain was seen at the time and afterwards as a very weak figure. But no, he was not. He was exactly the way you described him, Alex. He was a very ignorant and disastrously incompetent, but also, as such people as you and I both know often are, utterly self-confident figure, like the neoconservatives in Washington. And the one last point I'd like to add, and again, this is not a question, but in confirmation and appreciation of your wonderful presentation, when you write about this need of elements in the elite to generate chaos and feed off the chaos. This is the philosophical justification that neoconservatives are open about. They are Trotskyites of the right. Just as the original, and they are, the bloodlines are important to them because in well, you know this, of course, the Irving Kristol clan, the Buthoritz clan, the Kagan clan, it is extraordinary how often they put their children and grandchildren in positions of responsibility. Victoria Newland is the wife of Robert Kagan, who is a key figure himself in a neoconservative one. This ought to be ridiculous. It is interesting that these pseudo-intellectuals who claim the purity of the mind instead fall back on the most gross and selfish royal lines of lineage and aristocracy that they imagine they are creating for themselves and their children and their grandchildren. But that's the way they are, and B, they are open and saying their championship of democracy is basically chaos is good, upheaval is good. What will come out of chaos is better. Let's just stir it up and see what happens. Now, of course, they themselves refuse to live in such a world. They want to get away with it by stirring it up everywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
The one last point I will add is, and I've given previous presentations of this, the anarchists in the 80s, this aspect of liberal internationalism goes back much further than I ever dreamed. And I have 2 degrees in history from Oxford University 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Why? Because I think the first time, it may go back all the way to the French Revolution. It certainly goes back to revolutions in Latin America in the 1820s. These are always taught as elements of tremendous enlightenment, liberating people from the church, liberating people from the Spanish Empire across the whole Western Hemisphere. But you find after these events, for the native peoples from Mexico through the Brazilian rainforest and Peru, all the way down to Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, they are exterminated by the forces that take control of liberal capitalism and empire, of British Empire. British Empire is much more ruthless and murderous and thorough and systematic than the Spanish Empire ever was. And this is never studied and this is never taught. But when you look at where these revolutions come in the 1820s, it's exactly the same model we see in Ukraine today. And against in Hong Kong, we have the rhetoric of democracy, the rhetoric of civil rights, the rhetoric of liberation and freedom. The reality is very different.
Yeah,
and
correct.
I can add one very last point, and you and I have always felt a kinship with each other, which is strange because we are on such different ages and different societies, but it's there. And I now realize at least part of the reason why. Because what you found in Croatia, both in your 20s and your mature adulthood now, was exactly what I went through in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s when I was a young reporter starting out. I saw all these strange events going on around me and all these terrible events. And I saw it all, but I didn't realize what I was seeing. Like you, it literally took me decades to process these events in my own mind and reconceptualize the way I see. So I hope sometime in this life, even, we will get the chance in person, not just online, to catch up over limitless amounts of alcohol. Exactly. It would be nice. But
Brilliant.
Again,
I hope so. I hope so, Martin. Thank you.
Again,
thank you very much.
So much, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wanted also just to say, like if there were some messages and I didn't reply, I'm sorry. I'm kind of not managing to multitask a lot. So I only saw one like a few minutes ago and I replied. But if there were others and I ignored them, I didn't intend to ignore them. I just didn't see them if there were any for me. So I just wanted to say that I didn't mean to be rude,
You're a true gentleman, Alex, and no, you're doing your job perfectly. It was my responsibility to try to curate the chat room as best I can. But all that to say, I think that you have contact information on your website as well, right? So if people do want to send you an email or some question, they can reach you on your website if need be.
Yeah. It's not difficult. I have a LinkedIn profile where I listed my personal email somewhere. On Twitter I'm easy to find, and on my on my websites and my blog, I guess I don't know if my contact is listed, but people sometimes drop me a comment, and that's how I see them. And I also have a YouTube channel called Markets, Trends, and Profits, which also, if people message me there, in fact this presentation there's a version on that on the YouTube channel. There's a YouTube version for it.
So that's what we'll do. Send me everything you want me to include in the description box of this video, where people can look more into your work. Just a quick note before, and I'll make sure that that's there, including your book. I know it's not available on Amazon, but if there's any way that people could buy your book on the ugly, what was the Ugly Truth of Bill Browder, I forgot the exact title. Is there a way that people can buy that?
It's available. The only place where you can get a hard copy is at the website of Red Pill Press.
Okay.
However, if anybody is not, it costs, I think a copy is $26. It's not super cheap. But if anybody is not comfortable, but they are comfortable reading PDF, I'm always happy to send the book by PDF free of charge.
That is remarkably.
If anybody's comfortable reading on the screen in PDF, please contact me. Very happy to send a copy.
Excellent. quick note to Marty, based on what you just also introduced as a whole bunch of very fruitful concepts as seeds to be, I think, developed and grown. I sense a fuller lecture that is waiting to blossom. And so I'm hoping, I'm assuming that you're going to have no problem delivering something on this topic maybe in a few weeks. I take it by your smile and your energetic demeanor that I cannot hear because you're on mute, that you're okay.
Martin is on mute.
Okay.
I'm fearful of saying yes, but we have to talk about this.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. All right. Something's going to happen. I can see it. Okay, great. Alex, you are a most generous gentleman and a real wonderful intellect. I'm so happy to have you in our network, and thank you so much for taking the time to just bring.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. Thank you for bringing this big group of good people, and thank you all for staying with us and for your kind words, which I see scrolling. It's my pleasure and my privilege, and until the next happy occasion, I look forward to keeping in touch. Please feel free to always to contact me for any questions, any suggestions, and so forth. And God bless you, and onwards and upwards. I do genuinely believe that the future is bright, that the good side is going to win, and I think that part of what we're doing here may make a small but maybe important contribution to that.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, everybody.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. God bless.
Thank you.
Recording stop.